So wetlands are a whole bunch of different types of ecosystems that are either temporarily or permanently wet. So this one in particular, you can see how spongy it is an open bog. And bogs are just kind of characterized by the moss, a very particular type of moss. It's called sphagnum moss or peat moss. And when you look at the top of it, it kind of looks like a star. It's got 5 points. And this is a really good species for helping us fight climate change because as they grow, they get buried. And so because it's wet, they really don't break down. So you form these thick layers of organic matter that kind of get sequestered. And with all that organic matter is the carbon that has been fixed by plants from the air. And over time, it just gets buried and buried and buried and forms peatlands, which we use for gardening. Yeah, and if we don't disturb them, they hold the carbon for centuries and centuries and millennia. So this is called a forested wetland because it's dominated by trees, specifically a lot of red maple. And this is the type of ecosystem I monitor a lot and do a lot of my research on. And they're really just characterized by the presence of trees. There can be a few different types. So this is technically a bog because it's, again, dominated by this sphagnum moss. But it's just a treed bog compared to the other one. Yeah. It's very spongy. It's quite nice. I believe they used to make like bedding out of sphagnum moss. Yeah, and so the real difference between this one and the last one, obviously, is the trees, but why are the trees growing here and not there? It's likely because this site is slightly drier than the last one, but dry enough that the trees can really get a foothold and grow quite well. And this is the type of ecosystem where you find a lot of lichen diversity. So because there's trees, there's less shade reaching the ground, so it's overall cooler. And then because there's so much water in the soil, it's being evaporated into the air and creating that nice little warm, humid microclimate that lichens do really well in. This is also a type of ecosystem that supports a lot of bird species. And in Nova Scotia, unfortunately, a lot of our species at risk birds are wetland dependent. And that's because as a province, we have done a terrible job managing our wetlands. It's hard to say exactly how many wetlands have been lost since European contact. So for things like salt marshes that are marine ecosystems, we know it's 50, 70% have been lost over time. With forested wetlands, we think that number is closer to half. So that really gives an importance to the ones that do remain. So marshes are dominated by grass-like species. They're called graminoids, and they include true grasses, rushes, and sedges. So these ecosystems tend to be a little bit wetter than like a forested wetland. They also tend to have more nutrients, which is why the really good competing grass species can get a foothold and really take over. So the last thing I really wanted to mention about wetlands in Nova Scotia was our policy. We're actually quite lucky in the province to have a pretty robust wetland policy dedicated to protecting wetlands and the functions they support in Nova Scotia. So wetlands are actually really beneficial to humans. They do a whole bunch of things like storing carbon, like I mentioned earlier. They also mitigate flooding and drought, which is kind of counterintuitive. How can it do both? Well, because these ecosystems act like giant sponges, they can soak up excess water during flooding conditions. And then when things dry out again, they can slowly release that water back. And because there's so much vegetation and many different types of organisms, they tend to break down pollution. So they're really good at improving water quality. They act as habitat for many species, including many of our species at risk, including Canada warbler, olive-sided flycatcher, mainland moose depend on wetlands for especially the younger years with their calves. Yeah. So in Nova Scotia's policy, they have a goal of having no net loss of wetlands. So that generally means that they want to maintain the number of wetlands that exist now. So if a wetland does get approved for development, the developer has to kind of counterbalance the wetland they've taken away by either replacing it after they're done or creating a new wetland of equal value. We also have very special wetlands called wetlands of special significance. And they're basically just wetlands that are especially important. They protect a particular species at risk or a very vulnerable community. And those wetlands are not allowed to be developed at all.